Welcome to the Natural Cycle. This is a channel where we attempt to solidify the absolute. We appreciate you tuning us in. Thanks for joining us. Today we'll attempt to examine a realization that many victims of narcissistic abuse eventually arrive at after years of confusion. It is the realization that no matter how deeply they investigate the narcissist, no matter how carefully they communicate, and no matter how sincerely they attempt to understand the relationship, they never seem to reach the actual source of the problem. Most people assume that conflict exists because something has not yet been understood. They believe that if they continue asking questions, continue examining the evidence, and continue searching for deeper causes, they will eventually arrive at the truth. This assumption is reasonable because it works with psychologically healthy individuals. When two people are committed to reality, difficult conversations can produce insight. Progress becomes possible because both individuals are willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads. The narcissist introduces a fundamentally different dynamic. The victim enters the conversation searching for understanding. The narcissist enters the conversation searching for psychological stability. These objectives may appear similar on the surface, but they are entirely different beneath it. One person is attempting to discover what is true. The other person is attempting to preserve an identity. This distinction explains why so many victims become trapped in endless analysis. They assume they are participating in a shared investigation. In reality, they are participating in two different processes at the same time. The victim is trying to uncover causes. The narcissist is trying to avoid exposure. As a result, every conversation eventually begins to bend away from reality and back toward defense. The psychoanalyst Heinz Kohut spent much of his career studying narcissistic personalities. Kohut observed that grandiosity often functions as a defense against fragmentation and vulnerability. He described the narcissistic self as something that must be constantly stabilized through external regulation. When that regulation is threatened, defensive structures activate quickly and automatically. What appears to be confidence is often a compensatory attempt to maintain cohesion. What appears to be certainty is often protection against internal collapse. Once this principle is understood, many confusing interactions begin to make sense. The narcissist is not merely defending an opinion. The narcissist is defending a structure. Otto Kernberg, another major figure in object relations theory, described pathological narcissism as organized around a grandiose self that is maintained through splitting, projection, and devaluation. These defenses are not occasional reactions. They are structural mechanisms that preserve identity by keeping threatening emotional material outside of awareness. This is why victims often experience the same repeating pattern. Every time they believe they are approaching the root of the issue, the discussion shifts. The explanation changes. The narrative reorganizes itself. A contradiction is dismissed. A new accusation appears. The conversation moves away from investigation and toward justification. The victim assumes they are dealing with confusion or bad faith. In many cases, they are actually encountering a system designed to prevent psychological exposure. At this point, it becomes important to understand what is actually being protected. The narcissistic structure is not primarily protecting a belief. It is protecting a self-state. Beneath the layers of grandiosity and defense, there is often an intolerance of shame, vulnerability, and dependency. These experiences are not simply uncomfortable. They are experienced as disorganizing. They threaten the coherence of the self. For this reason, the mind develops elaborate mechanisms to prevent direct contact with them. Melanie Klein's work on object relations helps clarify another important layer of this process. Klein described how individuals internalize representations of others, forming internal objects that shape perception and emotional response. In pathological organization, these internal objects can become rigid and defensive. The narcissist does not always relate to the actual person in front of them. Instead, they relate to an internal version of that person that serves a psychological function. This internal object may be constructed as inferior, flawed, or needing correction. Once this structure is in place, real-time interaction becomes secondary to maintaining the internal narrative. This is where many victims become deeply confused. They attempt to explain themselves as real people with real experiences. They provide context. They clarify intent. They offer emotional truth. However, they are not always being received as they are. They are being filtered through a pre-existing internal construction. When reality does not match that construction, it is not updated. It is resisted. The result is a recurring breakdown in communication that feels almost circular. The victim believes they are moving closer to resolution. The narcissist is often moving closer to reasserting psychological position. This is where the interaction shifts from problem solving into something else entirely. It becomes a struggle over hierarchy. Who is right? Who is wrong? Who defines reality? Who holds authority in the interaction? This is the hidden structure beneath many narcissistic conflicts. On the surface, the conversation appears to be about facts or behavior. Beneath the surface, it is often about position. This is why logic alone rarely resolves the issue. Logic assumes shared commitment to truth. In this structure, truth is secondary to psychological preservation. Scott Peck, in his discussions of personality disorders, noted that evil in its most functional form is not always dramatic or chaotic. It can appear organized and even rational. He described it as a form of self-deception that is actively defended and projected outward. While his terminology is broader and more moral than clinical psychoanalysis, the underlying observation aligns with what many victims experience. The system is not designed to arrive at truth. It is designed to avoid internal collapse. At this point, the victim often reaches a turning point. They realize that no amount of explanation produces resolution. No amount of clarity produces understanding. No amount of emotional investment produces change. This is where frustration transforms into insight. The reason the root cannot be reached is not because the victim is failing to ask the right questions. It is because the system itself is structured to prevent access to the root. Every attempt to approach it activates defensive operations that redirect, distort, or reframe the interaction. The closer the inquiry gets to vulnerability, the stronger the resistance becomes. This creates a very specific psychological trap. The victim believes that persistence will eventually lead to breakthrough. In healthy systems, persistence does lead to breakthrough. In defensive systems of this kind, persistence often leads deeper into distortion. The search itself becomes part of the loop that sustains the dynamic. Understanding this changes the direction entirely. The goal is no longer to extract truth from the narcissist. The goal becomes recognizing the limits of participation in a system that cannot support mutual inquiry. Insight is no longer dependent on their cooperation. It becomes something that develops independently of their involvement. At this point, the search for the root transforms. It is no longer a search for what the narcissist is hiding. It becomes a search for why the structure prevents access in the first place. That shift is subtle, but it is decisive. Because once you see that the system is built to avoid its own root, you stop expecting it to reveal it. And that is often where the cycle finally begins to loosen. Thank you for watching The Natural Cycle. Please hit the thumbs up, share, like, and subscribe. Until next time, enjoy.